It was on a Friday afternoon in late June that the calm serenity of the Wiltshire countryside was gently disturbed by the arrival of a dark green Bentley. Its polished bodywork gleaming in the dappled light that filtered through the beech trees lining the winding lane. Greystone Manor emerged ahead, a proud, ivy-clad Edwardian estate nestled atop a soft hillock. Its pristine lawns and geometrically trimmed hedges suggested a life of elegant order, yet within its walls, human emotions simmered as unpredictable as summer weather. Chapter 1. Colonel Mortimer Luttrell stood at the large bay window of the drawing room, watching the car pull up with the stance of a man who took pride in punctuality and appearances, tall, broad-shouldered, and stiff-backed, even in retirement. The colonel wore a cream linen suit that matched the tone of the room's decor, old money taste restrained by military discipline. His mustache was groomed with the same precision that had once directed troops, but his pale blue eyes missed little. "Ah," he muttered to himself, "right on time. That'll be Bletchley, the old fox." Elsewhere in the house, the preparations for the weekend were nearing completion. Mrs. Beatrice Luttrell, Candace's wife, glided through the halls like a queen inspecting her court. Her silver hair was swept into a chignon, and her silk blouse bore the faint scent of lavender. She stopped briefly in the drawing room to rearrange a vase of white lilies and roses, frowning. "There to Stark, Mortimer." "Funeral?" I asked. "Charlotte for wildflowers an hour ago." The colonel didn't look up. "Let her be. The girl's shy, but she's got good instincts." Beatrice turned on her heel, not bothering to argue. Charlotte Ashcombe, their niece and an orphan, since the age of 11, had grown up in Greystone Manor under Beatrice's aloof but dutiful care. Now 23, Charlotte remained quiet, observant, and unfailingly polite, a ghost of a girl more than a guest in the East Garden. Charlotte knelt by a patch of foxgloves and delphiniums, her fingers careful not to bruise the stems. She had always preferred the gardens to the drawing rooms. Here, nature followed its own logic, tangled yet beautiful, like the brittle exchanges that passed for conversation inside the manor walls. She clipped a handful of soft pink blossoms, her mind drifting to the guest list. Already, the house hummed with uncomfortable energy. Lord Ambrose Kettering had arrived earlier that morning in a chauffeur-driven Daimler, a lean man with a hawk-like nose and gold cufflinks that gleamed too brightly. He'd charmed Beatrice with stories from Monte Carlo and eyed Charlotte with thinly veiled interest. Then came Lady Lavinia Marwan, old friend of Beatrice's. If friend was the correct term, Lavinia was the sort of woman who drank brandy before dinner, wore veils indoors, and referred to her 3 divorces as spiritual upgrades. Her presence guaranteed drama, and Beatrice, despite herself, enjoyed the company of a woman who said what she would not. Dr. Miles Bletchley was a different case entirely, balding, bespectacled, and with a pince-nez forever slipping down his nose. He had practiced medicine in the village for 3 decades. He was knowledgeable, sociable in an absent-minded way, and possessed a disturbingly large collection of preserved snakes and Egyptian relics. He was, however, the colonel's chess partner and confidant, though what confidences had passed between them, no one knew. Finally, there was Hugo Ashcombe, Charlotte's elder brother. In his 30s, Hugo carried himself like an explorer, returned from the jungle, though the farthest he'd traveled recently was the bar at his club in London. Brash, sunburned, and always slightly inebriated, Hugo delighted in hunting trips, gambling, and quoting Kipling in inappropriate contexts. Dinner that evening was served in the great hollow cavernous room with oak paneling, ancestral portraits, and a fireplace large enough to roast a stag. The table, set with crystal and china, gleamed beneath the light of a brass chandelier. Conversation was brittle, as if everyone were waiting for someone else to break the silence. "So, Lord Ambrose," said eventually, swirling his burgundy. "Any news from the War Office, Colonel?" Mortimer smiled thinly. I left all that behind. Kettering. I'm more concerned these days with pruning hedges than battlefronts. Ah, but secrets don't stay buried, do they? Lady Lavinia said with a sharp smile. Not in old houses. Like this. A shadow crossed Beatrice's face. Charlotte glanced at her brother, who smirked and raised a glass. To the colonel, then, a man of secrets and fine port. Mortimer stood. A toast. Yes, my dear friends, he said, voice firm. It is no small feat to see so many familiar faces gathered under one roof. In these times of uncertainty, I count myself blessed to friendship and to secrets, which I'm sure will stay safely buried. The laughter that followed was strained, though Mortimer appeared satisfied. Behind him, the wind pressed against the windows, rustling the curtains like an unseen hand. Later, as darkness settled over the estate, the guests dispersed to their rooms. Rain began to fall in soft sheets. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Charlotte, unable to sleep, sat at her writing desk with a book unopened on her lap. From the hallway, she heard a door creak open, followed by footsteps. A brief, whispered exchange intelligible. Then a sudden thud, a gasp, silence. The next morning, the household awoke to a grim discovery. Colonel Luttrell was found slumped at his writing desk in the study. His head lolled unnaturally to one side, and his fingers still clutched a folded piece of paper. His eyes were glassy and distant. No blood, no visible wounds. But there was a faint, almost sickly scent in the air like almonds. Clinging to the stillness of the room, the butler, pale and shaking, fetched Mrs. Luttrell. Beatrice stared at her husband for a long time before she spoke. Call the police, she said quietly, and ... we must send a telegram to Mr. Hercule Poirot. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Hawthorne of the Wiltshire Constabulary had arrived, blustery, formal, and immediately suspicious of everyone. He questioned the staff, took statements, and examined the study. He noticed the untouched decanter, the paper in the colonel's hand, a draft of a new will, unsigned, and the missing key to the locked liquor cabinet. A man doesn't drop dead in his own home without reason, Hawthorne muttered. Mark my words, it's one of them. But at precisely 10:23, a second car arrived, sleek, black, and humming like a well-fed cat. From it stepped a man of medium height, dressed impeccably in a tailored gray suit with a white pocket square, gleaming patent leather shoes, and a hat tilted just so. His mustache was perfectly waxed. His eyes alert and amused. Monsieur Poirot, the housekeeper exclaimed, startled. We hadn't expected you until I came at once, said Poirot, lifting a gloved hand. When one receives such a telegram, one knows there is no time to waste. Huh. He surveyed the manor, pausing just long enough to admire the symmetry of the windows and the curve of the drive. And when a man dies without visible cause, Poirot murmured, in a house full of old friends and older grudges. Abine, it is time to put the little gray sails to work. The rain had not yet ceased when Hercule Poirot was ushered into the grand entrance hall of Greystone Manor, though his shoes had touched the damp gravel only moments before. Tang, not a single drop of moisture clung to the immaculate shine of his patent leathers. He removed his gloves carefully, folded them once, and tucked them into his coat pocket. The manor's interior was as tasteful as it was controlled, soft lighting under high ceilings, Persian rugs anchoring mahogany furniture, and ancestral portraits surveying the scene with somber judgment. Poirot's eyes lingered briefly on the symmetry of the twin staircase, one curling left, the other right, like mirrored question marks. Beatrice Luttrell descended the east staircase with a kind of sculpted dignity. Her face showed strain. She retained a commanding elegance, her posture as precise as a calligrapher's stroke. Monsieur Poirot, she said, offering a hand that trembled ever so slightly. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Poirot gave a slight bow. Madame Luttrell, it is always the most tragic of calls that arrive swiftly. I grieve with you in your loss. Colonel Luttrell was a man of distinction. I trust I may see the scene before it is too disturbed. Beatrice nodded. Inspector Hawthorne is still in the study. Sway, if you please. As Poirot followed her through the corridors, he observed the details with a detective's patience. A Persian vase slightly askew on a side table, scuff marks on the wainscoting beneath the window, the scent of beeswax and rain-damp wool. The manor was orderly, but the kind of order that had been recently and hastily restored. Inside the study, the atmosphere was heavier. It was a room designed for powered dark walnut paneling, deep green curtains, and a massive desk that sat like an altar at the far end. Behind it, in the wide leather chair, Colonel Luttrell's body still rested, stiff and grim. Inspector Hawthorne stood nearby, flipping through a leather-bound notebook with exaggerated purpose, his brow furrowed when he saw Poirot. Ah, the famous Belgian detective. The words were not quite hostile, but shaded with a defensiveness born of pride. Didn't know we were bringing in outside help. Poirot offered a genial smile. I go only where I am invited, monsieur. I never seek to step on toes, only to observe. You have found no clear cause of death. No signs of trauma, Hawthorne said curtly. No wounds. The man simply expired in his chair. The physician says his heart was healthy, too healthy to simply stop. He leaned forward. But here's the curious thing. Do you smell that? Poirot nodded. A faint scent, bitter, but sweet also, like almond, cyanide, possibly, though we found no glass, no cup, no vial. Just this. Hawthorne handed over the piece of paper Luttrell had clutched in death. Poirot unfolded it. A will, or more precisely, a draft of one. Handwritten, unsigned, and with several lines crossed out. The last paragraph was underlined, and to Charlotte Ashcombe. I leave Greystone Manor and all estate holdings therein, that she may have the peace I once sought, but never found. Poirot's brow arched. A new will, undelivered, to a solicitor. He crossed the room slowly, eyes darting to the decanter, the bookshelf, the fireplace grate. No signs of struggle. Smudge on the edge of the desk, drawer barely visible. The chair, oddly angled from its normal position. Poirot knelt beside the hearth and retrieved a half-burnt match from the ashes. Was the fire lit last night? He asked. It was a warm evening, Hawthorne replied. It's unlikely. Poirot turned the match over in his fingers, his expression unreadable. Even warm nights have cold intentions. They left the room in silence, Hawthorne reluctantly agreeing to allow Poirot informal access to the house and its guests. Beatrice led Poirot to the morning room, where tea had been laid out strong, Darjeeling in porcelain cups, untouched biscuits, a sugar bowl undisturbed, a kind of morning ritual for the well-bred. The guests had gathered like moths, unsure of where to flutter. Lady Lavinia reclined on a chaise longue near the window, wrapped in a paisley shawl and smoking a long cigarette with theatrical disinterest. Lord Ambrose Kettering paced near the French doors, hands clasped behind his back, as though awaiting a duel. Dr. Bletchley sat perched on the edge of a settee, peering at Poirot with faint academic curiosity. Hugo Ashcombe stood by the sideboard, already fixing himself a brandy, though it was not yet noon. Poirot stepped into the room, not as a predator, but as a puzzle master admiring a complex board. All the pieces were here. Now came the game. Good morning, madame, messieurs, he began, his voice smooth and courteous. I am Hercule Poirot, and I have come not as a policeman, but as a seeker of truth. I hope, with your help, to bring clarity to this most unfortunate tragedy. Is it murder, then? Lavinia asked, her voice sharp despite the silk. Dead, Poirot said mildly, is what we shall discover together. Hugo let out a scoff. Let's not pretend this is some drawing room melodrama. The old man had a weak ticker. Things happen, indeed, said Poirot. But the man's physician says otherwise. Hey, and when a man dies while drafting a will that disinherits nearly everyone present, a being, the matter becomes curious. Lord. Ambrose cleared his throat. Surely you're not implying that any of us. Poirot raised a hand. I imply nothing, monsieur. I only ask questions. Okay, simple questions. For example, who was the last to see the colonel alive? There was a pause. I passed him in the hall just before midnight, said Dr. Bletchley. He said he had forgotten a document in the study. He looked quite well. I heard him too, said Lavinia. I sleep above the study. He was listening to music, some wartime march on the gramophone, if I recall. No one else. Poirot's gaze swept the room. Charlotte entered then, late, with a tray of fresh-cut flowers. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Poirot. Monsieur Poirot, I didn't know you had arrived. Miss Ashcombe, he said gently. It is I who should apologize, coming under such sorrowful circumstances. These are lovely foxgloves. She nodded. He liked them. I thought they might. Soften the study. Indeed, Poirot studied her carefully. Tell me, mademoiselle, did you see your uncle last night? She hesitated. No, I was in the garden after dinner. Then I read in my room. I thought I heard voices around. Midnight, but I didn't go to check. Poirot's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. A tea. He turned back to the room at large. One last question for her now. Did anyone notice anything out of place? Something missing, perhaps. There was a brief exchange of glances. Then Bletchley spoke. Now that you mention it, the colonel always kept a small onyx paperweight on his desk, a gift from his India days. I noticed it was gone when I leaned in to look at the will. A small detail, Poirot murmured, but one does not ignore small details. He smiled, almost whimsically. The truth, Mies Amos, is like a mirror. Even the smallest crack distorts the image. I shall begin asking each of you for a brief conversation, in private, tranquilment. Until then, please do not wander too far. He stepped back, hands folded neatly before him. The drawing room had grown quieter. The guests stared at Poirot, now seeing him not as a guest, but as something else entirely. Not the seeker of justice, but its inevitable deliverer. Chapter 02. The door to the colonel's library closed with a soft click behind Dr. Miles Bletchley. Poirot sat in an armchair near the unlit fireplace, legs neatly crossed, a notebook unopened on the low table beside him. He preferred to rely, first and foremost, on memory and instinct, the way someone blinked when they spoke or failed. Two, please, Dr. Poirot said with a courteous gesture. Sit. We will not speak long. Just a few questions. Nest si pas. Dr. Bletchley adjusted his spectacles and took the edge of a stiff wing-back chair. His tweed trousers gave a faint rustle, and the faint smell of pipe tobacco clung to him. He folded his hands in his lap. You've already asked in front of everyone, he said mildly. I told you I saw Mortimer before midnight. He said he was returning to the study for a paper he'd forgotten. He looked, well, perfectly alive at the time. Yes, but now we are alone, and memory. It sharpens under the soft lamp of privacy. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Were you close with the colonel? We were chess partners, played every Wednesday night without fail. He was difficult, but decent, old-fashioned, took his honor seriously, sometimes to a fault. Did he ever confide in you? Personal matters? Bletchley frowned. Not as such, but he did mention once or twice that he'd grown weary of managing the estate, the taxes, the staff. He said it would fall to someone younger soon. He didn't say who. Poirot nodded slowly, absorbing the cadence of Bletchley's tone. The way his eyes darted slightly when recalling the word younger. A subtle discomfort. Did he speak to you of a new will? The doctor hesitated. No, but I'm not surprised. His brother's son had expectations, but Mortimer, he thought the boy reckless. Too much time at the races. I had assumed everything would go to his wife. Yet it was not so, Poirot said gently. He left the estate to Miss Charlotte Ashcombe. Bletchley looked genuinely surprised, his eyebrows lifting. To Charlotte, that is unexpected. She's a sweet girl, but hardly capable of running a property like Greystone. Poirot studied him carefully. So you believe her unfit? Bletchley flushed slightly. No, I meant only ... She's sheltered. She lacks experience. That's all, Mercy. Doctor, you have been very helpful. Kindly ask Lord Ambrose Kettering to join me next. With a nod, Bletchley stood and left, only just remembering to close the door behind him. Poirot made a small note. Bletchley, evasive, surprised by Charlotte's inheritance, mild discomfort. Lord Ambrose entered moments later, his cologne preceding him by several seconds. He wore a charcoal waistcoat with a fresh pocket square, as though appearances had become more urgent since the death. He sat without being asked, crossing one leg over the other, hand brushing lint from his knee. Colonel Luttrell was an old comrade, he said smoothly, a fellow gentleman. We dined together in London a few times each year. I attended out of loyalty and respect. Poirot inclined his head. Of course. And did you know about the new will? Only what was said this morning. Seems unorthodox. Unorthodox, yes, Poirot agreed, but not illegal. Did you ever have disagreements with the colonel? Heavens, no. Lord Ambrose's laugh was low and practiced. We weren't close enough for that. I found him rather rigid. Cole was quoting regimental codes at dinner. You flattered him, Poirot said dryly. Ambrose grinned. Don't mistake me, I liked him, but a man like Luttrell makes enemies whether he means to or not. That level of control, it rankles. You seem to understand him quite well for someone who wasn't close. Kettering shrugged. I've met many like him. Power does strange things to men, especially when they begin to lose it. Poirot regarded him for a long moment. And you? What were you hoping to gain from this visit? Kettering smiled, faltered for half a second. Nothing, monsieur. A quiet weekend. That was all. Poirot said nothing, but his silence carried weight. When Ambrose rose to leave, Poirot remained seated, his gaze thoughtful, his hands steepled beneath his chin. A few minutes later, Lady Lavinia Merrill entered with all the dramatic flair of a duchess summoned to an inquisition. She wore a violet scarf draped loosely around her neck and carried a silver-tipped cane, more accessory than necessity. My dear Poirot, she said as she lowered herself gracefully into the seat opposite him. I assume we must now all parade our skeletons for your inspection. Poirot smiled. Only if they are relevant to murder, madame. Oh, they're all relevant, especially in houses like this. She tapped ash into a porcelain tray. I warned Mortimer. Secrets ferment. They do not stay bottled. You know what he told me? Poirot leaned forward slightly. Do enlighten me. He said he had found peace. But Mortimer was a man who mistook silence for peace. That house was full of ghosts, some of his own making, some older still. Is that why you came? To confront him? Lavinia raised an eyebrow. I came for Beatrice. We're friends, once until she decided society mattered more than honesty. And yes, Mortimer and I had ... history. What kind of history? She waved a hand, the kind that ends badly, but without scandal. I knew better than to entangle myself with a man like that. He needed control. I prefer chaos. Did you know about the will? Lavinia's lips curled. Everyone suspected that the colonel was fond of Charlotte. Overfond, perhaps. Poirot did not react, but the phrase lingered in the air like smoke. Do you think Miss Ashcombe capable of such a crime? He asked gently. She's more capable than she looks, Lavinia said, stubbing out her cigarette. Grief makes a fine disguise. Poirot made a small note as she left Lavinia. Perceptive, bitter, possibly jealous, sighs, inappropriate. Attachment to Charlotte. Believes Beatrice valued appearances. The door opened again. Next, asked Poirot, glancing up. It was Hugo Ashcombe. He entered like a man who had no intention of being interrogated. His jacket was wrinkled, his collar askew, and he carried a faint whiff of liquor beneath his cologne. I'll make this quick, Hugo said, slumping into the nearest chair. I didn't kill him. I barely liked him. Defense, Monsieur Ashcombe, Poirot said. Difference rarely clears one's name. Look, Hugo said, scratching at his temple. Mortimer never saw me as anything but a drunk, which, fine, maybe I am. But murder, that's not my style. Takes too much planning. Did you need the money? Poirot asked. Everyone needs money, Hugo snapped. But Charlotte was always his favorite. Even as kids, he'd let her sit in his study while I got sent out to chop kindling or scrub boots. Ah, so there is resentment. It's plenty. But again, not motive. Not for me. Poirot studied him carefully. And Charlotte, do you trust her? Hugo's gaze flickered. She's a good girl. Soft. Maybe too soft. She wouldn't hurt anyone. Not deliberately. Not deliberately. Poirot echoed softly. Hugo stood. We done? For now, Monsieur Ashcombe. Poirot remained in the chair, alone now. The notes dancing in his mind like chess pieces before the first move. Bletchley, the confidant. Kettering, the watcher. Lavinia, the whisperer. Hugo, the outcast. And Charlotte, the inheritor. Each one had touched the shadow of the colonel's last night. Each one had a motive, but motive alone was not enough. There was something else, something unseen, and Poirot, with his little gray cells already at work, was about to uncover the first crack in the mirror. The morning sun crept slowly over the Wiltshire horizon, its golden light failing to warm the chill that had settled over Greystone Manor. Though breakfast was laid out in the conservatory, fresh bread, soft-boiled eggs, and pots of steaming Tino 1/8 with any conviction. Conversation was minimal, confined mostly to the polite scraping of cutlery and the occasional muffled cough. Poirot did not eat at all. He sat quietly at the end of the long glass-top table, sipping black coffee from a small porcelain cup. His eyes scanned the others, as if watching a play unfold, each movement catalogued with that unerring precision for which he was known. Inspector Hawthorne entered just as the toast was going cold, his boots echoing ominously on the tiled floor. He wore an expression of barely concealed satisfaction, as if he'd solved something of monumental importance before the rest had even risen from bed. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, brushing a speck from his lapel, I won't keep you long, but we've reviewed the scene, cross-referenced statements, and consulted with our chemist. We believe we have sufficient cause to detain a suspect. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Poirot didn't move. Hawthorne's gaze landed, firm and accusatory, on Charlotte Ashcombe. Miss Ashcombe, I'm afraid you'll have to come with us for further questioning. Charlotte froze. The porcelain teacup in her hand trembled visibly, clinking softly against the saucer. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Beatrice stood at once. This is absurd. Charlotte. She's never harmed a soul in her life. Perhaps, said Hawthorne evenly, but the facts align poorly for her. She inherits the estate under the newly drafted will. She had opportunities she was unaccounted for most of the night, and more importantly, he turned toward Poirot. We found residue on a pair of gardening gloves in the shed, traces of potassium cyanide, quite a potent dose. Poirot said nothing, his gaze resting on Charlotte. I don't understand, Charlotte said, her voice small. I've never even seen cyanide. Why would it be in the garden? That's the question, isn't it? Hawthorne said. Oh, but the gloves were yours, monogrammed. Lord Ambrose Kettering leaned back in his chair. Well, that's a twist. Lavinia lit another cigarette, the flame from her lighter trembling slightly. Poor girl, she muttered. Or clever girl. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? Poirot finally set down his coffee and stood. Monsieur Hawthorne, he said mildly, may I see the gloves? It's there with my men in the study. Then let us go there. S'il vous plaît. The room remained hushed as Poirot and Hawthorne disappeared down the hall. Charlotte remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Hugo, uncharacteristically silent, glanced at her once, but said nothing. The tension thickened. In the study, Poirot examined the gloves carefully. They were soft brown leather, weather-worn and creased at the knuckles. On the inside of the left cuff, stitched in pale thread, were the initials C.A. Clever indeed, Poirot murmured, more to himself than to Hawthorne. You don't sound convinced, said the inspector. I am not, Poirot replied plainly. It is too neat, too simple. Mademoiselle Charlotte is not stupid. If she were guilty, she would hardly leave evidence so obvious. Or perhaps she wanted it found, Hawthorne suggested. Guilt sometimes manifests in strange ways. Perhaps, Poirot said, perhaps someone counted on the obvious being believed. He turned and walked back to the conservatory, his mind already sifting through variables. Charlotte sat in the same position, though her face had grown paler. Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, I must ask you some unpleasant questions. She nodded. Were these gloves yours, Yes, they were, but I haven't worn them in days. They were kept in the shed with the other tools. Who else had access to them? She shook her head slowly. Anyone. The shed isn't locked. Poirot turned to Beatrice. Madame Luttrell, was your husband known to use the gardening shed? No, Beatrice said with certainty. He kept to his own study. He left garden matters to Charlotte. I see. Poirot paced slowly. And where, madame, does your staff keep the household poisons? Weed killer, insecticide, anything dangerous? In the root cellar, she replied. Locked. Only Parsons, our groundskeeper, has the key to ours being. Then one must ask, how did a lethal quantity of cyanide find its way onto gloves, left in an unlocked shed? No one answered, because, Poirot continued, if one wished to frame another, one would do exactly this. Take a common object, easily associated with the victim, and taint it. Then one leaves it to be found. Kettering raised an eyebrow. You make it sound almost artful. Nan, monsieur, it is crude. Artful misdirection is subtler. Poirot's voice remained calm, but his eyes glinted with the force of his logic. And that is precisely what I find lacking here, subtlety. The person who orchestrated this wanted Charlotte arrested, not suspected. They were eager, desperate, perhaps. Hugo stepped forward. You saying someone's trying to pin this on my sister? Kay, I'm not merely saying it, monsieur. I am suggesting it strongly. Hawthorne looked unconvinced. And, you suppose, we simply disregard the gloves? No, Poirot said. You follow the facts, but you do not mistake them for the truth. The facts are pieces of a puzzle. The truth is the picture they form. He turned back to Charlotte. Tell me, mademoiselle, did your uncle ever express concern for his safety? Once, she said slowly, about a week ago. He said he'd had a strange feeling, like someone was watching him from the orchard. I thought it was just his imagination. Poirot nodded, deep in thought. And did he ever mention completing this new will? No, I didn't know about it until you showed it to us. Poirot paused. And were you aware that the will had not yet been signed? She blinked. No, ... I assumed ... Precisely, Poirot said quietly. Many might have assumed. But only someone who knew the will wasn't yet valid would have reason to act urgently. If it had already been signed and witnessed, then a murder after the fact would not prevent its execution. He looked around the room. So we must ask ourselves, who knew of the will before it was discovered in the colonel's hand? There was no answer, just silence. Poirot folded his hands behind his back and addressed Hawthorne. For now, I suggest you do not arrest Miss Ashcombe. Place a guard if you must, but do not disgrace her. The true murderer is still among us, and they are watching, perhaps even listening. With that, he turned and walked from the room, leaving the house in stunned stillness behind him. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the hedges gleamed in the light. Poirot stood at the edge of the east garden, staring down at the soft, damp soil near the shed. His mind, ever methodical, ticked through every movement, every glance, every lie, and every silence. This was no crime of passion. This was design, but soon the symmetry would break. And when it did, Poirot would be waiting. Chapter 03. The gardens were still slick from the night's rain, and Hercule Poirot moved through them with careful steps, lifting his polished shoes clear of puddles with almost comic delicacy. He paused near the sedan, old stone structure with moss-covered corners and a door that hung slightly ajar. He ran a gloved finger along the edge of the handle. Damp, but no fresh prints. It was not the shed itself that interested him now, nor the gloves that had been discovered so conveniently within it. It was something far simpler. An object that had once been present mentioned in passing Gand, now, very notably, was not the onyx paperweight. Poirot had a mind that catalogued every detail, no matter how insignificant. He remembered clearly that Dr. Bletchley had mentioned it during their interview in the library, a small, oval stone ornament from India, once a gift to the colonel, usually kept on his desk. But when Poirot had examined the study, there had been no such item. Where, then, had it gone? He made his way back into the house, politely declining the offer of tea from the housekeeper. Instead, he returned to the study and stood at the threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimmer interior light. The room had not been altered since the colonel's death. Poirot had insisted upon it. He stepped carefully to the massive, walnut desk, eyes scanning every surface. There, beside the ink blotter, sat a brass pen, a stack of correspondence, a pair of reading spectacles, and the unsigned will. But no paperweight. Poirot moved behind the desk and knelt, examining the lower drawers. Nothing out of the ordinary documents, sealed envelopes, old invoices. He glanced again at the fireplace. He had already examined the grate earlier, noting only a half-burned match. Still, he crouched again, scanning the hearth. No paperweight, not even a shard. He straightened up and turned toward the window, his mind worrying. The paperweight had been used as a murder weapon if, for instance, it had delivered a silent blow to the head. There might have been signs, but Colonel Luttrell had shown no external injury, and the attending physician had seen no signs of trauma. Still, the absence of the object troubled Poirot. A tidy man like the colonel would not misplace such things. This disappearance was not coincidence. It was omission-intentional. He exited the study and made his way to the drawing room, where Charlotte sat reading quietly beneath a tall window. The book trembled slightly in her hand as he approached. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "may I ask you a question about your uncle's study?" Charlotte looked up with tired eyes. Of course, it was, perhaps, an object of sentimental value, a paperweight, onyx, From India. Do you recall it? She nodded slowly. Yes. He always kept it on his desk, a black oval with gold inlay. Told me it had been given to him during his commission in Delhi. Poirot raised a brow. Did you notice it missing the morning you found him? I didn't think to look, she admitted. Everything else seemed frozen in place. Mais, oui, Poirot said softly. It's frozen, indeed. And yet, one item has vanished. Curious, is it not? He turned, pausing briefly before continuing. Tell me, mademoiselle, was your uncle left-handed? Left-handed. She blinked. No, right-handed. Poirot nodded again. Then you will forgive me, for I must now ask another favor. Would you be so kind as to retrieve the house's inventory record? Charlotte looked confused. Inventory? Yes, he smiled. This is an estate of order, a house with a system. You are the type to keep such things, perhaps not personally, but your housekeeper, your solicitor. There may be a record of objects in each room, even the colonel's desk. I suppose Parsons might have a record, she murmured, and rose, to check with the housekeeper. Poirot stood at the hearth as she left, hands clasped behind his back, eyes distant. A single missing object, small and easily overlooked, could speak volumes, especially if its disappearance served no clear purpose, lest that purpose was deception. 15 minutes later, Charlotte returned with a bound ledger. Poirot flipped carefully through the crisp pages until he reached the section labeled Study, Desk, South Wall. His finger traced the lines. Walnut, desk, twin drawers, stationary settee very ladder, opener, onyx, paperweight, -1, black, gold, oval, origin, India there. It was, listed neatly, a known presence, now mysteriously absent. Poirot turned the page slowly. Thank you, mademoiselle. You are most helpful. I want to help, she said quietly. I need to prove I didn't. You need not prove anything, Poirot interrupted gently. Truth has a curious way of presenting itself, especially when one ceases to chase it. He left her then and ascended the main staircase, past the portraits of stern-eyed ancestors, until he reached the guest wing. The rooms were arranged in a line, each with a brass nameplate affixed to the door. He paused at Lord Ambrose's chamber. The door was open and the room unoccupied. Poirot stepped inside. The decor was crisp, impersonal. 2 leather-bound travel cases sat beneath the window. On the writing desk, a half-written letter lay exposed. ... Regret to inform you, the agreement must be delayed. The colonel has not yet. Poirot frowned slightly and carefully pocketed the letter. He turned to the wardrobe and found suits, arranged by shade. He noted a faint scuff on one of the polished shoes, reddish smear, like brick dust or soil. He exited quietly and proceeded to Dr. Bletchley's room next. Inside, he found a collection of medical books, several vials of herbal remedies, and tucked behind a leather volume on tropical diseases, locked metal box. Poirot did not open it. Yet, his final visit was to the farthest room on the landing, Lady Lavinia Moreau's. He knocked. Enter, came her voice, languid and amused. She reclined on a fainting couch near the window, a glass of sherry in her hand. To what do I owe this pleasure, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot gave a slight bow. I merely seek insight, madame. I am intrigued by the disappearance of a single object, the colonel's onyx paperweight. She lifted a thin brow. Gone, is it? You recall it? Of course. He showed it to me years ago. Claimed it calmed his nerves to look at it. Then, you agree its absence is significant? Lavinia gave a shrug. Significance depends on intention. The colonel rarely did anything without it. If it's missing, someone wanted it that way. Poirot inclined his head. Madame, he exited, pausing briefly in the hall. The house was full of people pretending not to watch one another, and yet each of them had, however, slightly betrayed themselves in posture, in glance, in tone. Poirot returned to the study once more. This time, he opened the bottom drawer of the desk and felt around the back edge. His fingers brushed a small groove, unusual. He pressed lightly, and a false panel shifted with a dull click. Inside was a cloth pouch. Poirot lifted it with delicate hands, tying the cord. Out tumbled the missing paper-weight dark onyx, streaked with gold, slick, with something faintly sticky to the touch. Poirot examined it under the light. There, at the bezel, faint reddish smear. Not blood, not ink, clay. He turned the object over and smiled faintly. "Ah," he whispered. "Now we begin to see." The pouch rested on the study's desk like an accusation, quiet, undeniable. Poirot stood over it with his hands behind his back, the recovered paperweight now gleaming faintly in the morning light. It had been hidden deliberately, yet not expertly. The false panel had yielded with little resistance, though designed not to conceal forever, but to delay discovery just long enough. He stared at it a moment longer before placing it gently back in its cloth wrapping. There was no time to waste. Poirot emerged from the study and instructed Charlotte to summon everyone to the drawing room save for Inspector Hawthorne, whom he asked to remain in the study for a private word. When Hawthorne arrived, Poirot held up the pouch without preamble. "The missing paperweight," he said. Hawthorne frowned. "Where did you find it?" "In a false panel within the colonel's desk. Hidden, but not well. Look here." Poirot turned the object to the base, showing the dull smear of red clay and the faintest mark in edge chipped ever so slightly, as though it had struck something hard. "Could it be the murder weapon?" Hawthorne asked. "I do not think so. The blow of such an object would leave evidence bruising, perhaps a fracture." And the post-mortem report mentioned nothing of the sort. "Then what are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Poirot said quietly, "that it was meant to be missing, that its absence was intended to distract, perhaps, to suggest a struggle that never occurred, or to remove an item that bore some damning association." Hawthorne crossed his arms. "But then, why not destroy it?" "Because," Poirot replied, "the person who hid it is not ruthless, not entirely. They are desperate, but not bloodthirsty. There's hesitation in the concealment, not confidence." Poirot looked toward the door, where the sound of distant voices trickled in. "So now I shall learn why." He left the inspector and returned to the drawing room, where the household had gathered. They stood or sat in uneasy silence. Lady Lavinia sipped from her glass with affected boredom. Lord Ambrose tapped his fingers on the arm of a chair. Hugo Ashcombe leaned against the fireplace, arms crossed. Charlotte remained nearest the window, her hands folded tightly. Poirot cleared his throat, and all eyes turned to him. "Mies, Amos," he said, "you must forgive my continued questions, but they are necessary. A man has died, and we now know. His will was to change the futures of several among us. The colonel's death was not without consequence, and where consequence exists, so too does motive." He turned first to Lord Ambrose. "Monsieur Kettering, I visited your room this morning. I hope you will forgive the intrusion." Ambrose blinked. "Well, if you must. I found a letter on your writing desk I'd addressed to your creditors in London, stating that a forthcoming agreement with the colonel had been unexpectedly delayed. Might you elaborate?" Ambrose's jaw tensed. "It's no secret I've had some financial setbacks. Mortimer promised an investment. He was to buy a share in a land development scheme I've backed in Surrey. Nothing illegal, I assure you. But if the colonel changed his mind, if, say, he chose to leave his estate to someone else, you would be left, exposed." "I might be disappointed," Ambrose said icily, "but I'm not a killer." Poirot nodded, then turned to Hugo. "And you, Monsieur Ashcombe? You speak freely of your grievances with the colonel, the preference he showed for Charlotte, the lack of faith he placed in you. He had reason, Hugo muttered, avoiding eye contact. Ah, but I wonder, Poirot continued. Does resentment not fester when ignored too long? Particularly when your fortunes are tied to the kindness or disdain of a man who viewed you as a failure? Hugo glared at him. Didn't need his approval, and I didn't need his money. All I ever wanted was to be left alone. A noble desire, Poirot murmured, but even noblemen may act from wounded pride. He pivoted to Dr. Bletchley, who had thus far remained quiet. Doctor, he said gently, you knew the colonel well. You played chess with him, yet you never once mentioned that you held a locked box behind your book swan that contains several chemical agents, including, I suspect, potassium cyanide. Bletchley paled. I am a physician. I studied toxins for academic purposes. The box is secure. Yet, someone knew of its contents, Poirot said. Okay? Someone who knew how to access them discreetly, never left it open. Bletchley insisted. Never. I'm not careless. Poirot raised a hand. I do not accuse, I only observe. But we must accept that opportunity existed for more than one person. He turned then to Lady Lavinia. And you, madame? You speak of secrets fermenting in silence. You once loved the colonel. She smiled thinly. Loved is a grand word. I was young. He was commanding. Yet he chose another. Beatrice, Lavinia said with venom. Of course. Did it embitter you? She met his gaze. Bitterness is a woman's weapon, Monsieur Poirot, but murder is a man's game. Not always, he said softly. Sometimes bitterness drives the hand that writes the poison. Poirot's gaze finally settled on Charlotte. And you, mademoiselle, you have inherited everything if the will is on it. But did you know it was unsigned? Charlotte's eyes welled with tears. No, I never asked him for anything. Was kind to me. He gave me more than I ever deserved. Poirot stepped forward. You see, Mies, Amos, each of you had something to gain or lose by the colonel's decision. Money, respect, revenge, freedom. He moved to the fireplace and lifted a folded paper from his breast pocket. This, he said, is not the, well, this is a copy of a letter written by the colonel to a solicitor, dated 2 weeks ago. In it, he instructs the solicitor to draw up a new will and arrive to witness it this week. That visit was scheduled for tomorrow. A murmur swept the room. So you see, Poirot continued, the will we found was not valid. But only one. Among you knew that for certain. Someone who saw the draft in the colonel's studior was told of its incompleteness, and that someone acted quickly because they knew the window was closing. He walked back toward the center of the room. Now, I must ask who knew the will had not yet been signed. No answer came, but Poirot saw the flinch. A subtle intake of breath. A being, he said. The motive becomes clearer. But still, the method that remains hidden, yet not for long. He looked at Hawthorne, who stood in the doorway, watching intently. I believe it is time we re-examine the timeline of the night. The music, the match in the grate, the movements through the hall. There is a pattern forming. Poirot turned back to the others, and soon the truth will reveal itself not with a shout, but with a whisper. He gave a small, satisfied smile. One always finds the killer. Not by who shouts the loudest, but by who is too quiet at just the wrong moment. Chapter 04. Evening settled uneasily over Greystone Manor. The sky, streaked with purples and bruised grays, cast long, brooding shadows across the grounds. Inside, the mood had shifted. Gone were the polite exchanges and forced civility. Now, suspicion moved through the halls like a draft beneath a closed door, silent but constant. Charlotte had retreated to her bedroom, too overwhelmed to eat. Beatrice lingered in the parlor, hands shaking slightly as she poured herself a sherry. Hugo prowled the hallways, claiming he needed air, but returning each time with more unease on his face. Lavinia, as always, observed everything with that half-lidded expression of disdainful amusement. Poirot remained largely silent during dinner, sipping consigne while his thoughts moved like clockwork gears behind his eyes. Inspector Hawthorne sat beside him, still visibly irritated that Poirot had postponed Charlotte's arrest and allowed everyone to roam freely within the estate. "This is a mistake," Hawthorne whispered, leaning closer. "You're giving the killer too much freedom." Nan Poirot replied calmly, "I am giving them just enough rope." Hawthorne scowled. "You're waiting for them to try again." Poirot's only response was a small nod and a glance toward the grandfather clock in the corner at 10:30. The house began to quiet. Lights dimmed. The servants retired. The old pipes of gray stone clanked their nightly tune as the chill deepened. Most of the guests made their way to their rooms with little more than a tense good night, but the silence didn't last. At precisely 10:47 p.m., a scream pierced the manor. It came from the east wing, a short, sharp cry that rose and cut off like a blade. Poirot was already on his feet before the final echo died, his slippers nearly silent on the polished floor as he followed the source. Hawthorne was close behind, pistol drawn. They turned the corner and found the door to Lady Lavinia's room flung wide. Inside, she stood at her dressing table, pale as the ivory handle of a brush, one hand pressed to her chest. A shattered glass lay at her feet. Poirot stepped inside. "Madame, what has happened?" She didn't speak at first, just pointed, with a trembling hand, to the bed. There, laid out with almost ceremonial care, was the onyx paperweight. Poirot froze. He had left it locked in his valise. Hawthorne pushed past him, eyes scanning the room. "How did this get here?" Lavinia found her voice, low and hoarse. "It was not there an hour ago. I was brushing my hair. I went to the bathroom, and when I returned, it was on the pillow, waiting." Poirot turned sharply toward the hallway, but no one else was there. He moved to the paperweight, careful not to touch it, and leaned in. The faint smell of damp earth lingered on it still. He looked beneath the pillow. Nothing else. No note, no threat. Just the objects, the same one once hidden in the colonel's desk, now paraded like a dark trophy. "Someone is making a statement," Poirot muttered. Hawthorne's jaw clenched. "What kind of statement?" "One of power," Poirot replied. "Of proximity. They are reminding us they can enter and exit any room unnoticed, that they can touch what we fear without fear of being caught." Lavinia sank into her chaise. "Who would do such a thing?" "Someone who wants to frighten you," Poirot said. "Or perhaps someone who wants to draw attention away from another." He turned to Hawthorne. "Search the manor. Quietly. No disruption. Look for anyone out of their room. Anyone with wet boots. Anyone missing gloves." Hawthorne nodded and left, barking quiet orders to the constables stationed on the lower floor. Poirot stayed with Lavinia. He offered her water, then gently asked, "Had you seen this object since it disappeared?" "Only once," she whispered. "Earlier today. You mentioned it, but I didn't know it had been found." Poirot studied her face. "You were certain it was not in your room earlier?" "I swear it." "This isn't some parlor game, Monsieur Poirot. I am frightened." Poirot gave a small bow of his head. "Okay. Then you must trust me, madame. Okay. The truth comes not in waves, but in ripples." This was such a ripple. A warning, yes, but also a mistake. He retrieved the paperweight, using a handkerchief to wrap it, and secured it once more in his valise, this time locking it and placing it beside his chair. By midnight, the manor had returned to silence, but it was the silence of a hunted forest. where every shadow might hold fangs. Hawthorne returned with his report. Nothing. Everyone claims to have been in their rooms. No muddy boots, no missing gloves. Doors locked, windows closed. Poirot didn't seem surprised. Whoever planted the paperweight, he said, did so earlier. It's likely during dinner. They counted on the object being found later, alone, and making an impact. Psychological warfare, Hawthorne muttered. Exactaman. Poirot retired to his chamber, but not to sleep. Key sat at the small desk by the window and laid out a sheet of paper. On it, he drew a circle, then began writing names inside. It, Colonel Mortimer Luttrell. Deceased, Charlotte Ashcombe, heir. Opportunity, no clear method. Hugo Ashcombe, bidder. Unstable, access to shed. Lord Ambrose Kettering, financial ruin. Knew about investment delay. Dr. Bletchley has cyanide, knows chemistry. Overfamiliar. Lady Lavinia Moreau, emotional history, received message. Generally frightened. Beatrice Luttrell, widow, gains nothing, but hiding something. He tapped the pen against his lip. Then he drew a line beneath the names and wrote one more. Unknown orchestrator, stage manager, slips through cracks. There had been someone in the house, perhaps among them, perhaps not, who moved to Isley. Someone who manipulated without leaving fingerprints. Poirot folded the page and placed it inside. His journal the next day would bring answers, but tonight had brought something even more valuable. Fear, and in fear, the guilty revealed far more than they did in confidence. Morning came reluctantly to Greystone Manor, as if the sun itself was unsure whether to rise over a house steeped in death and suspicion. Fog hung low over the gardens, dampening sound and muffling the world in an eerie hush. The gravel paths glistened with dew, undisturbed inside. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the breakfast room, spooning a soft-boiled egg with delicate precision. His eyes, however, were not on his plate. They were fixed on the grand staircase, just visible through the open doorway. He was waiting not for a revelation, but for a reaction. The incident with the paperweight had changed the energy of the house. Fear now lived in the hallways. It was no longer enough to whisper behind doors or glance sidelong at a rival. The killer had revealed their presence, and Poirot intended to use that revelation against them. Inspector Hawthorne entered. A little sleep-deprived, a little frustrated. No developments overnight, he reported quietly. No one left there. Rooms again. Whoever did it has gone back to hiding. Poirot nodded, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. That is to be expected. The criminal has taken a bold step in. Now they wait to see how we respond. The game, mon ami, is not one of speed. It is one of tension. You pull the string to hard snap, and they retreat. Pull too softly, and they continue undetected. Hawthorne poured himself coffee. And what are you suggesting we do? We play our hand carefully, Poirot said. Draw out the subconscious reactions, the tells. You see, there is one advantage I possess, not only the little gray cells, but the understanding of human nature. Fear, guilt, pride, they are reliable tools, but even more useful than that. He paused, watching the entrance as Charlotte entered, followed closely by Hugo. His misdirection, Poirot finished softly, by mid-morning. The full household had assembled in the library at Poirot's request. The fire was crackling quietly in the hearth, and a faint scent of cedar smoke filled the room. Poirot rose from a leather armchair near the window and addressed the group with his usual calm authority. Mesdames et messieurs, I must ask for your indulgence. I have called you here not to accuse, but to observe. There was a rustle of unease. To observe, Lord Ambrose repeated. Oui, Poirot said. You see, I believe that what occurred last night was no spontaneous act. It was staged. Someone here went to great lengths to unsettle Lady Lavinia to remind her of the paperweight's significance. Lavinia remained seated, her face unreadable. "But why her?" Beatrice asked softly. "Because," Poirot replied, "the murderer believes she is vulnerable. That fear will make her speak. Perhaps, confess." He turned toward Lavinia. "Madame, you mentioned yesterday that you once shared affections with the colonel." She inclined her head. "Long ago. Kay, did those affections ever result in correspondence?" Lavinia blinked. "Letters, Kay's. We exchanged quite a few in our youth." Poirot nodded slowly. "And were they, personal?" Lavinia's lips tightened. "They were private, but hardly scandalous," Poirot pressed gently. "Were they ever used against you?" Her fingers clenched slightly around the armrest. "Once, many years ago, when Mortimer announced his engagement to Beatrice, someone left one of my letters on his desk. A final twist of the knife. I never discovered who." Poirot glanced briefly toward Hugo, whose gaze remained downcast. "That is most interesting," Poirot murmured, "because it tells us two things. First, that there has long been someone in this house who eavesdrops, who watches. And second, that betrayal here did not begin with murder. It began with secrets." He let the silence stretch. "And secrets," he added, "have a way of festering." Dr. Bletchley leaned forward, his voice strained. "Monsieur Poirot, are we to sit here day after day while you unravel every dusty corner of our past?" "Doctor," Poirot said, with a small smile, "that is precisely what I must do." He turned to the group. "I intend to stage a small gathering this evening, a final toast in the colonel's honor. I believe, with the right pressure, the truth will present itself." "A sort of pressure?" Ambrose asked, eyeing him warily. Poirot only smiled. That evening, just before sunset, the drawing room was lit with candles and warmed with brandy. The setting was intimate but formal. A silver tray of canapes sat untouched on the sideboard. Poirot stood near the fireplace, his waistcoat immaculate, his mustache even more so. He watched each guest arrive. Hugo slouched in, visibly irritated. Lavinia entered next, serene as ever. Ambrose followed, nursing a drink. Beatrice and Charlotte arrived last, arm in arm, fragile but present. Poirot waited until the room had settled before speaking. "This toast," he said, raising his glass, "is not merely to the memory of Colonel Luttrell, but to the end of fear. For tonight, Mies Amos, we will stop hiding." Everyone raised their glasses, but the toast was mechanical. No smiles, no comfort. Poirot lowered his glass and stepped aside, revealing a small object resting on a cloth-covered tray on the table beside him, the onyx paperweight. A collective shiver passed through the room. "I recovered it again this morning," Poirot said, "from my own locked valise, which means one of you had a key or found a way past the lock." Beatrice stood. "This is madness." "No," Madame Poirot said gently. "This is precision. I am not seeking madness, I am seeking order. The symmetry of motive, means, and opportunity." He turned to the fire. "The colonel was killed, not with force, but with calculation. The poison potassium cyanide was likely administered in a drink. The colonel took port after dinner. The decanter, though full, was not locked away afterward. Easy to tamper with." Hugo scoffed. "So now we all poisoned the port." "Nan," Poirot said, "only one of you did. But another, second person placed a paperweight last night, which means the killer is not working alone." Gasps filled the room. "A collaboration," Poirot said, "can be built on many things. Love, loyalty, fear, even blackmail." He let the words settle. Then he turned to face the group fully. "I have one more test," he said. "I will retire in 1 hour. My valise lock will remain here in plain view. Within it, Nothing but papers. A beat passed. But if anyone tampers with it, if anything moves, I shall know. He stepped away. Good night, Mies, Amos. And, with that, he exited, leaving behind a room filled with silence and a single, waiting trap. Chapter 05. The drawing room was transformed that evening into a theater of poised expectancy. Candles flickered gently on the mantelpiece, casting delicate shadows against the richly patterned wallpaper. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tightly, shutting out the chill night and the restless world beyond. One by one, the assembled guests took their places around the room, a circle of faces tense with anticipation. Even the servants hovered discreetly near the doorways, sensing the significance of the moment. All eyes inevitably turned to Hercule Poirot. He entered with his customary grace, a small notebook in hand, his mustache impeccably waxed, his gait measured and dignified. The sparkle in his eye bespoke a man who knew the value of timing and the exquisite pleasure of revelation. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice calm and deliberate. We have been gathered here tonight, not merely to seek answers, but to understand the nature of truth itself. The truth, as I have come to learn in my many years, is rarely a single, clear note. Rather, it is a symphony, complex, nuanced, and sometimes discordant. He paused, surveying the circle of faces. Tonight, I shall play the conductor, guiding us through the movements until the final crescendo. There was a collective breath held, as though the room itself waited for the first note. Poirot started slowly, his hands folded before him. We have seen how the colonel's death was a result of careful planning, but also human frailty. Let us recall the setting: a man surrounded by those he trusted, and yet betrayed by someone close. He turned to Charlotte, who sat rigid, clutching a handkerchief. Mademoiselle Ashcombe, you inherited the estate under the terms of the unsigned will. You were kind to your uncle and respected, yet you did not know the will was not yet formalized. Charlotte nodded, eyes downcast. Poirot smiled gently, precisely. And yet, the unsigned will was a secret held closely by the colonel and his solicitor. If you did not know, then who did? He shifted his gaze to Lord Ambrose Kettering. Lord Ambrose, you had much to gain by the colonel's change of heart. Your financial difficulties were well known, and the investment opportunity that might have rescued you was withdrawn at the last moment. You claim you would not harm a man, yet opportunity presented itself. Ambrose bristled. I may have been desperate, Monsieur Poirot, but I am no murderer. Indeed, desperation alone does not make a man a killer, but it can make him reckless. Poirot continued. Hugo Ashcombe, your resentment was palpable. The colonel's favor toward Charlotte was no secret, and your frustration with your own failings obvious. Hugo's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Dr. Bletchley, Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Your knowledge of poisons is unparalleled here. The potassium cyanide found in your locked box is a deadly substance. You profess innocence. The doctor swallowed. I am a scholar of toxins, yes, but I would not use them for murder. Yet you kept the box within reach, and you were the only one with medical expertise in the household. Poirot's gaze softened. Sometimes it is not the knowledge, but the heart that determines action. Lady Lavinia Marrow's eyes glittered with a mixture of fear and defiance. You once loved the colonel, yet your love ended in bitterness. You were hurt by the arrival of Beatrice and the colonel's renewed affections. Your anger was no secret. Lavia's lips pressed into a thin line, and Beatrice Loutrell Poirot said gently, the widow. You appear to gain nothing from the colonel's death, yet your silence is telling. Beatrice's breath caught. Now, Amos, Poirot said, clasping his hands. Let us consider the paper with the missing piece that first drew my attention. It was not a weapon. Rather, it was a symbol, a message, planted deliberately. Hey, he held up the small, smooth onyx object, its surface glinting in the candlelight. Whoever removed it from the desk created a distraction, a red herring. Yet, they left clues, small but vital. Poirot's eyes sparkled with delight. The faint traces of red clay upon its base, for example, indicative not of the garden, but of the soil in the shed. Heads turned slightly toward Hugo, whose brow furrowed. And yet, the paperweight appeared last night in Lady Lavinia's room, a brazen act, meant to intimidate or misdirect. Poirot's voice grew softer, more intimate. But the true signature was elsewhere in the port. Key turned toward Inspector Hawthorne. The decanter was accessible. It could have been tampered with after the others had passed their glasses. The dose of cyanide, small but fatal, would not alter taste or smell. Poirot paused to let the weight of the statement sink in. Only one person would have had both the opportunity to tamper with the drink and the knowledge to do so without detection. Key let his gaze sweep the room again. The physician's expertise is undeniable, but knowledge alone is not motive. Poirot's eyes lingered on Beatrice. Nor is motive always financial. A long silence stretched. Poirot's hand moved to his notebook. I have considered every word, every gesture, every hesitation. Okay? And the truth is, a delicate tapestry, woven of love, fear, jealousy, and regret. He stepped forward. The killer is not the one who shouted accusations, nor the one who sought to flee. The killer is the one who remained calm to calm, his voice lowered to a whisper, the one who, in the presence of others, feigned ignorance while quietly plotting. Poirot fixed his gaze on Charlotte. Charlotte Ashcombe, your kindness was genuine, yet your inheritance hinged on the will's signing, and your hands were clean of the poison. She looked up, a flicker of relief and confusion crossing her face. Poirot turned then to Lady Lavinia. Madame, your bitterness was real, but your fear genuine. You sought to intimidate, yes, but not to kill. Lavinia nodded slowly, and Hugo Ashcombe, Poirot said, okay. Your resentment was clear, but your alibi solid. Hugo's eyes were dark, but he nodded in acceptance. Ambrose shifted uncomfortably, but maintained silence. Poirot raised a finger. The clue that finally unraveled the mystery was in the study, the false panel behind the desk. Only one person could have discovered its mechanism. Turned to Dr. Bletchley. You were present when the solicitor visited last week, saw the draft of the will. You knew it was unsigned. Bletchley's face paled. Moreover, Poirot continued, your expertise in poisons gave you the means. Your position as trusted physician gave you opportunity. Poirot's gaze sharpened. But what drove you to kill? The doctor's voice was barely audible. The colonel was going to disinherit me, cut me out of his will entirely. I was desperate, afraid of losing everything. Poirot nodded gravely. Fear is a powerful motivator, but so too is guilt. He took a deep breath. The paperweight was planted to divert suspicion, to create chaos, but in hiding it so clumsily, you've revealed a truth beyond your control. Bletchley's shoulders slumped. I never meant for it to go so far. Poirot smiled, though his eyes were somber. Justice is not merely the punishment of crime, but the unveiling of truth. He looked at Inspector Hawthorne. Arrest him. Hawthorne stepped forward and placed handcuffs on the doctor, who offered no resistance. Poirot turned to the remaining guests. Madame et Messieurs, the shadows are lifted. The puzzle is complete. The pieces have found their place. A collective exhale filled the room. Poirot's lips curved into a small smile. Now, peace may return to Greystone Manor. The dawn light filtered softly through the tall windows of Greystone Manor, painting the drawing room in pale gold and gray. The house, once a hive of suspicion and tension, had settled into a quiet calm that felt both fragile and inevitable. Outside, the first bird song wove a tentative harmony with the gentle rustling of the autumn leaves. Hercule Poirot sat alone by the fire, his hands folded neatly over his lap, the faintest smile playing upon his lips. The events of the previous evening hung in the air like the final note of a carefully composed symphony, resolved, yet lingering in its emotional resonance. Inspector Hawthorne stood near the doorway, watching the detective with a mixture of admiration and reluctant respect. The man who had so thoroughly unraveled the tangled web of deceit and fear was now at peace, at least for a moment. Poirot, Hawthorne began, I must say, I doubted your methods at first, but you were right. The mind is the greatest weapon and the greatest key. Poirot inclined his head modestly. Mon ami, it is not the weapon, but the hand that wields it. The little gray cells guide us, but it is the heart that must understand. The room was filled with the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, the world slowly resumed its rhythms, oblivious to the tragedies and triumphs contained within these walls. I expect Dr. Bletchley will face his day in court soon, Poirot mused. Justice will be served, but it is not always so. Simple, Hawthorne nodded. The truth is often more painful than the lies. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Ah, yes, but truth is necessary for peace, for healing, perhaps for forgiveness. A servant entered with a tray, carrying fresh tea and delicate pastries. Poirot thanked her with a gracious nod, then turned his attention to the window, watching as a lone figure, Charlotte Ashcombe, walked slowly through the garden. Her posture still stiff, but with a hint of release in her step. She has suffered much, Poirot said softly, but there is resilience in her. Oui, indeed, Hawthorne agreed. She will need all her strength in the days to come. Poirot reflected silently for a moment before speaking again. This case, he said, reminded me that beneath the veneer of civility lies a complexity of human desires and fears. The colonel's death was not just a crime, it was the consequence of long-held secrets and unspoken regrets. He paused, steepling his fingers. Each person in this house carried a burden. Ambrose's desperation, Hugo's bitterness, Lavinia's wounded pride, Beatrice's silence, and Charlotte's innocence, all intertwined in a dance of circumstance. Poirot's gaze met Hawthorne's, and the poisoner Dr. Bletchley was the last player in this tragic game. His fear of loss, his grasping for control, pushed him beyond reason, beyond reason. Hawthorne exhaled slowly. It's a reminder, isn't it, that even the most learned and respected among us can fall prey to weakness. Precisely, Poirot agreed. We must never underestimate the power of fear and the lengths to which it will drive a man. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Poirot rose, smoothing his waistcoat. I shall be leaving soon, he said. There are other puzzles to solve, other minds to engage. But Greystone Manor will remain with me as a lesson in the delicate balance between order and chaos. Hawthorne smiled. I'll be glad to call you again when the next one arises. Poirot bowed. It would be my pleasure. As Hawthorne departed, Poirot took a final look around the room, the familiar furniture, the heavy curtains, the portrait of Colonel Luttrell staring down with quiet dignity. He stepped to the window and opened it, letting in the fresh air of a new day. Outside, the world was waking up. The clouds had parted, revealing a bright blue sky, and for now, justice had been served. Chapter 06. Greystone Manor's calm seemed a fragile veneer, as if the very walls held their breath against the weight of memories best left undisturbed. The investigation had officially concluded, the guilty identified, and yet, beneath the surface, currents of unease rippled steadily onward. The village, beyond the estate, small and tightly knit, had begun to stir with whispers. In the dim corners, of the local pub and in hushed conversations behind lace-curtained windows. Old stories resurfaced dailies of long-buried grievances, clandestine affairs, and unspoken betrayals. The shadows of the past were creeping forward, and even the manor's inhabitants could not escape their reach. Charlotte Ashcombe sat by the window in the morning light, a journal open in her lap, but her eyes unfocused, lost to the distance beyond, the garden's blooming hedgerows. Her face bore the traces of sleepless nights and heavy thoughts. The weight of inheritance was heavy indeed, but heavier still was the burden of family history. A gentle knock interrupted her reverie. Beatrice Luttrell entered, carrying 2 cups of tea. Her expression softened from the stoic reserve she had once maintained. "Charlotte," Beatrice said quietly, "I thought you might like some company." Charlotte smiled faintly. "Thank you, Beatrice. It's difficult, isn't it, to move forward when the past feels so present?" Beatrice nodded, settling beside her. "We both carry scars. Perhaps it is time we faced them together." Their conversation meandered, delicate as lacework, touching on memories of the Colonel and the complicated relationships woven through the years. There was no grand reconciliation yet, but a tentative truce and mutual recognition of shared loss. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the manor, Hugo Ashcombe paced the library, his frustration mounting. The investigation had cleared his name, yet the tarnish on his reputation remained. His thoughts turned often to Lavinia Merrill, whose subtle glances and cryptic remarks hinted at knowledge he could neither claim nor confront. One evening, as twilight deepened, Lavinia approached him quietly in the hall. "Hugo," she said, voice low, "there are things we have both ignored, old wounds that fester beneath polite smiles." He stopped, surprised by her candor. "What are you suggesting? That the past will not stay buried forever," she replied. "Secrets do not simply vanish. They wait, patient, persistent." Hugo's jaw tightened. "And what then? We are prisoners of our histories." Lavinia met his gaze steadily. "Only if we allow it." Their exchange was interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps, deliberate, slow. Both turned toward the sound, but saw no one. Elsewhere, in the servants' quarters, hushed voices spoke of rumors and strange sightings. A missing letter, a whispered confession, and an unfamiliar visitor who had been seen lurking near the manor. In the days before the murder, Poirot, ever attentive to the unseen threads, summoned Inspector Hawthorne for a discreet meeting. "Inspector," Poirot said, "I have been considering the wider picture. The ripple of this case extends beyond what we see here." Hawthorne frowned. "You suspect others were involved?" "Not necessarily," Poirot replied. "But there may be others who hold pieces of this puzzle, those unwilling to come forward." Poirot's gaze was sharp, almost predatory. "We must be vigilant." That evening, Poirot invited the remaining household members to the library once again. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I do not believe the tale is finished," Poirot announced. "There are whispers, shadows in the corners of our vision." He laid out new documents, letters discovered hidden in a forgotten drawer in the Colonel's study. Letters that hinted at financial dealings and personal grievances that had never been revealed. As he read aloud a particularly poignant note, Beatrice's face paled, and Lavinia's hands clenched tightly. "These letters," Poirot continued, "suggest a deeper entanglement, web of loyalties and betrayals reaching back years." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We must ask ourselves, are we truly finished with the past, or merely postponing its reckoning?" The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Charlotte, summoning her strength, spoke at last. "I want the truth, no matter how painful." Poirot nodded approvingly. "And so you shall have it," he said. "For every shadow cast by a secret, there is a light waiting to reveal it." The night deepened, and the guests departed with minds full of questions, yet unresolved. Poirot remained by the fire. His fingers steepled once more, his mind working quietly, meticulously. The case had evolved, was no longer a simple tale of murder and motive, but a living story of human frailty and tangled histories. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, as if carrying the secrets of the past, eager to be heard. The morning sun cast a muted glow through the heavy curtains of Greystone Manor's study, where Hercule Poirot sat surrounded by a small pile of aged letters, some yellowed with time, others freshly inked, yet dusty from neglect. His sharp eyes moved meticulously over each word, every phrase examined with his trademark precision. The little gray cells were once again summoned to unravel threads tangled over years. Inspector Hawthorne stood nearby, his demeanor serious but respectful. The atmosphere was quiet, save for the soft scratch of Poirot's pen as he made notes. These letters, Poirot mused aloud, revealed a complex web of relationships and unspoken tensions, financial woes, debts, promises broken, and long-held grudges. Hawthorne nodded. It seems the Colonel's life was more complicated than appearances suggested. Mais oui, appearances are often the mask that society wears, hiding truths beneath. Poirot reached for a letter sealed with a wax crest, breaking it open carefully. This one, from Lady Lavinia Marrow to the Colonel, hints at a secret liaison years ago. A bond that was ended abruptly and bitterly. He glanced at Lavinia, who sat across the room, composed but visibly affected. Such revelations can explain much the resentment, the unhealed wounds. Lavinia met his gaze steadily, but said nothing. Poirot continued, reading aloud fragments from a letter penned by Ambrose Kettering to a creditor, detailing desperate measures and a hidden loan that could ruin him if exposed. The room shifted with the weight of these disclosures. Even Charlotte Ashcombe looked unsettled, her youthful face creased with worry. Poirot's voice softened, the tangled threads of money and emotion intertwined tightly. One cannot always separate the two. He set the papers aside and turned toward Hugo Ashcombe, who had been quietly listening in the corner. Hugo, Poirot said, your anger at your family's decisions was clear, but this letter from you to the solicitor suggests you sought reconciliation. Hugo's jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly. I wanted to make peace, but it was too late. Poirot folded his hands. Regret is a powerful emotion. Sometimes it motivates redemption. Sometimes despair. The detective's gaze swept the room once more. It appears the Colonel's death was but the climax of many silent struggles. At that moment, a soft knock sounded on the door. The solicitor, Mr. Everett, entered with a sheaf of papers. Detective Poirot, he said, I found these among the Colonel's personal effects. They may shed light on the will and recent financial transactions. Poirot took the documents, scanning quickly. Ah, here is something notable. He pointed to a ledger. Payments made to an unknown party, marked as consultation fees. Curious for a man of the Colonel's standing. Everett nodded. I had wondered about that myself. Poirot smiled faintly. Mystery within mystery. It seems someone has been playing a careful game. That evening, Poirot gathered the household once again. The letters and documents had brought new questions that needed answers. I believe, Poirot began, that the true story of Greystone Manor extends beyond a single crime. It is a story of human frailty, trust betrayed, and secrets kept too long. He turned toward Lavinia. Madame, can you explain the nature of your relationship with the Colonel? Lavinia's eyes reflected a mixture of pain and resolve. It was a love, I thought, eternal. But circumstances tore us apart. In the letters you sent, Poirot pressed gently. Attempts to reclaim what was lost, she admitted. Poirot's gaze softened. It is clear your emotions ran deep. He shifted to Ambrose. Lord Kettering, your financial troubles are no secret. Who is the recipient of these consultation fees? Ambrose swallowed hard. I was being blackmailed. Murmur rippled through the room. By whom? Poirot inquired. Ambrose hesitated. I do not know. The messages were anonymous, but the threats were real. Poirot leaned forward, eyes sharp. Fear and desperation, a dangerous combination. Beatrice Luttrell spoke quietly. Could this be connected to the murder? It is quite possible, Poirot replied. Each piece of this puzzle hints at unseen hands. Charlotte looked up. Is there more we should know? Poirot nodded. Indeed, the threads we have begun to unravel suggest that the past is not yet fully revealed. He turned to the group with a decisive air. I intend to pursue these new leads at once. The truth will emerge. That night, as the manor settled into uneasy sleep, Poirot sat alone in the study, reviewing the letters and ledgers once more. His mind worked tirelessly, fitting each piece into place. For all his genius, Poirot understood the limits of certainty. In human affairs, there were always shadows, and sometimes was the faintest light that revealed the deepest truths. Outside, a faint breeze whispered through the trees, as if the very earth conspired to carry secrets forward. Chapter 07. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke as dusk settled over Greystone Manor. Rain lashed against the windows in a relentless rhythm, as if nature itself sought to cleanse the air of long-held secrets. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and unspoken fears. Hercule Poirot stood in the study, his figure calm and composed against the backdrop of storm-darkened skies. The letters, ledgers, and new evidence lay arranged neatly before him, like pieces of a delicate puzzle waiting for the final touch. Outside the room, the household gathered once more, summoned by Poirot's subtle command, their faces drawn and expectant. Madame et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice steady and rich with the familiar theatrical flourish that had become his hallmark. The time has come to weave together all the threads of this tangled mystery. We have seen how human passions, love, fear, jealousy, and desperation have shaped the course of events. But now, we must confront the facts. He looked around the room, eyes sharp, catching every nuance of expression. Let us begin with the consultation fees paid by Colonel Luttrell to an unknown party. This was not a mere financial transaction. It was a payment for silence bought to hide a secret. Poirot's gaze settled on Lord Ambrose Kettering. Lord Kettering, you spoke of blackmail. The payments you made were to keep certain truths from emerging. Yet, you did not know who your tormentor was. Ambrose's shoulders sagged, the weight of his predicament made visible. Indeed, Poirot said, and that ignorance was your vulnerability. He moved toward Lady Lavinia Merrow. Madame, your letters to the Colonel reveal more than lost love. They speak of an arrangement and understanding that was to benefit both parties, but which soured with time. Lavinia's lips pressed into a thin line. Your bitterness was a poison, much like that which claimed the Colonel's life, Poirot continued. He turned to Beatrice Luttrell. You, Madame, were quiet in your grief, yet your silence spoke volumes. Your ties to the Colonel were not only of marriage, but of hidden conflicts that now come to light. Beatrice's hands trembled slightly. Charlotte, Poirot said gently, your innocence is clear, but you are not untouched by the currents that swept through this household. Charlotte nodded, the gravity of the moment pressing upon her. Poirot's eyes then fixed on Hugo Ashcombe. Your anger was a fire within you, but your conscience held you back. Yet, even you have secrets. Hugo's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Poirot took a deep breath. Now, we poisoned the weapon of our tragedy, was administered with care, but the plan was flawed. He produced a small vial from his pocket, the remnants of the cyanide still faintly glistening within. The murderer sought to disguise their actions beneath layers of misdirections. The paperweight, the tampered port, the false accusations. But the truth was always waiting, hidden in plain sight. He paused, his voice lowering. Dr. Bletchley was the obvious suspect, given his knowledge of toxins and opportunity. But the true mastermind, that is where the tale deepens. Murmurs stirred among the guests. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. The person who paid for the poison was none other than Lady Lavinia Moreau. The room fell into shocked silence. Lavinia lifted her chin, eyes defiant. "Yes, it was I," she admitted. "I did not intend for the colonel to die, only to scare him, to force him to honor our agreement." Poirot nodded. And yet, fear is a volatile force. It took control. She looked at the gathered faces. "I felt betrayed, abandoned by the man I loved. When the new will surfaced, favoring Charlotte and ignoring me, I saw no other way." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "You enlisted Dr. Bletchley, knowing his desperation. You believed you could control the outcome." Lavinia's eyes glistened with tears. "I was wrong. I did not anticipate the consequences." Poirot stepped forward. "This is the lesson, mes amis, that human motives are never simple. Love and hate, hope and fear, intertwined in a dance as old as time." He turned to Inspector Hawthorne. "Madame Moreau will answer for her part in this tragedy, but justice must also consider intention and remorse." The inspector nodded, solemn dot. As the gathering dispersed, Poirot lingered, contemplating the storm. Still raging outside, the case was nearly closed, but the echoes of its truth would resonate far longer in his private study. Poirot poured himself a cup of tea. The steam swirling like the tangled threads of human nature he had so carefully untangled. With a satisfied sigh, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The game, he mused, was never truly over. There would always be new mysteries, new puzzles, waiting for his little gray cells to unlock. The early morning sun spilled gently over the rolling hills, surrounding Greystone Manor, casting long shadows that slowly receded in the growing light. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving a freshness in the air that seemed to breathe new life into the ancient trees and flower beds. But despite the renewal outside, the manor's interior still carried an echo of the tumultuous days now behind them. Hercule Poirot stood by the grand window of the drawing room, hands neatly folded behind his back, gazing thoughtfully at the landscape that had been the stage for such human drama. The garden's roses were still wet with raindrops, shimmering softly in the morning sun, as if nature itself had been weeping for the lives forever altered within these walls. The detective's expression was serene, yet behind his calm facade, the wheels of his mind continued to turn, reflecting, as ever, on the fragile balance between justice and mercy, truth and illusion. Inspector Hawthorne entered quietly, careful not to disturb Poirot's reverie. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "the manor seems to breathe easier today, and yet I sense the weight of this case will linger." Poirot turned, a slight smile touching his lips. "Ah, Inspector, justice is but one chapter in the story of humanity. The past has been unearthed, the guilty held accountable, but the echoes remained." Hawthorne nodded, taking a seat near the fireplace. "Do you think the others will find peace?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with gentle wisdom. "Peace is a journey, not a destination. Charlotte Ashcombe, I believe, will grow into the strength her ancestors would admire. Beatrice Ludrow has shown grace and resilience beyond expectation. Lord Ambrose Kettering faces the consequences of his choices, but perhaps now, with clarity." He paused, considering. "And Lady Lavinia Moreau, her path is the most difficult, for remorse weighs heavily upon her heart. Yet, even in darkness, there can be light. Outside, the soft chirping of birds filled the air. The manor seemed to exhale, as if releasing a breath held for too long. Poirot moved to a small table where a letter awaited him, an invitation to a new case in London. "Mon ami," he said, "the game is never truly over. There will always be mysteries to unravel, puzzles to solve. The little gray cells must remain ever vigilant." Hawthorne smiled. "And we will be grateful to have you at our side when next they arise." As the inspector prepared to leave, Poirot lingered by the window once more, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. The people of Greystone Manor would move forward, carrying the scars and lessons of the past. Life, as always, would continue, complex, unpredictable, and endlessly fascinating. And Hercule Poirot, with his keen intellect and unshakable charm, would continue his pursuit of truth, forever balancing logic with empathy, justice with compassion. For, in the end, as Poirot often reflected, it was the human heart that held the final mystery.